We're beginning with Chapter 2 of The Ultimate Evil, an investigation of America's most dangerous satanic cult with new evidence linking Charlie Manson and the Son of Sam by Maury Taylor. The Gun of August. Slowly, because that's the way it was done, he crept closer, quietly, trying not to make a sound. Stealth, he knew, was essential. His quarry was elusive and easily spooked. He'd already missed several opportunities this day, but not this time. This one was ready to be taken, now. He dropped the net and the blue crab slithered mindlessly away. Son of a bitch, George Austin muttered. He raised the net again and slammed it into the water in frustration. These things are made for fish, not crabs. Don't you know that? Behind him, near to the shore, I started laughing. They're gonna recall your Gold Grove Award, I shouted. You'd better stick with the claims. They don't move fast. Austin, 31, a brown-haired insurance broker and a friend of 5 years, turned around, grumbled unfavorably about my lineage, and began inching a path farther out of Davis Park, Fire Island, into the Great South Bay. I decided to join him and soon found myself just as luckless in the quest for a seafood dinner. In the summer of 1977 was such a bountiful one for crabs. Then where the hell were they? The bay water was warm and glistening in the late day sun as we waded along, nets in hand, probing the shallow water for the slowly propelling shadow that signaled supper was near. I feel like an anti-submarine pilot, George complained. This is different. It wasn't this way in Rockaway Beach in the early 50s. When, as a child of 6, I'd go crabbing daily while on vacation. Rockaway in those days was the borough of Queens' half-hearted answer to the New Jersey ocean resorts. All the Irish in Yonkers rented bungalows in Rockaway then, it seemed. But crabs never swam like this in Rockaway Bay. In fact, I couldn't remember them swimming at all. My grandfather and I would stand on a pier, drop collapsible wire nets over the side, then let them hit the bottom and open. Then it was a matter of waiting for the crabs to crawl into the wire and nibble at the fish bait tied inside. Raise the line, the cage was closed, and hello dinner. Times had certainly changed, and so had I. I was nearing 31 that summer of 1977. In the 9 years since college, I worked at IBM in Westchester County, in the northern suburbs of New York City, as an editor and feature writer for a number of the company's publications. It was good, decent work, and it paid fairly well. But I found myself restless, a wayward wind skimming the land for something new, something more. For as long as I could remember, I sought challenges, and that sometimes bothered me because I felt like I should be more settled. Many of my contemporaries were sure with their jobs and families, content with 9 to 5. I wasn't. Why that was so, I couldn't answer, but that quizzical trait would soon involve me in the most bizarre, frustrating, and yet rewarding experience I'd ever known. In a short time, my career and life would be changed forever. I joined IBM rather than write for the Westchester newspaper chain. As a varsity baseball player and golfer with a competent background in football and basketball, I landed a part-time sports reporting job while still in college. But I became terribly disillusioned in the aftermath of Martin Luther King's murder in April 1968. Working alone that night in Port Chester, New York, for the Daily Item, I returned from covering a basketball tournament to find a 2-block stretch of downtown in shambles. Fires, rioters, and looters ran wild. The police and firefighters seemed helpless as they ducked bricks, bottles, and garbage being tossed at them from the rooftops and the tenants' windows. I stood with them on the streets that night, all 21 years of age, and went back to the paper to write the story. The Item was a small afternoon paper, and I manned the office alone at night. So I let myself into the darkened building and typed the piece I'd seen. There'd been there had been extensive property damage, some 19 arrests, and several dozen others could have been booked. But the editor killed the story, compiled their own, and buried it around page 10 with a headline that said, in effect, "Sporadic Violence Hits Village." The next day, I drove with my girlfriend from my home 20 miles away in Yonkers, just to obtain a copy of the paper that didn't print my story. I then took her through the urban battlefield so she could satisfy herself that I wasn't hallucinating. She was stunned, and we both learned a lesson we wouldn't forget. I saw how the game was sometimes played and gladly accepted IBM's offer. Since that time, the ownership of Westchester newspaper passed to the Gannett Corporation, and standards changed for the better. But it was too late for me, or so I thought. Within the corporate world, I survived, even prospered, a victim and yet a beneficiary of this compulsion to explore new horizons. I also did some freelance work in the music and travel business and was a partner in an investigative sports journalism TV project that almost, but not quite, made it to the air. But full-time employment did have its advantages, such as paid vacations, and that's what I was doing on Fire Island on Saturday, July 30th, 1977, enjoying the last 2 days of a leisurely 10 at a friend's beach house. What's new with Sam? George Austin cut in, knowing my fascination with the sensational series of murders that was immobilizing New York City. It was a guaranteed conversation starter. I wasn't the only one engulfed in that drama. Everyone, it seemed, was following the saga very closely, including George McLeod Austin, so nicknamed because of his resemblance to Dennis Weaver's TV detective. I didn't have any special knowledge of the case. I wasn't the part of the media or law enforcement fraternities. I was an outsider reading the newspapers, watching television, and listening to radio to absorb all I could about the son of Sam. Like thousands of others, I was trying to figure out who or what he was and where he was. It was an incredible time, for never before had one single ongoing criminal investigation captured the attention and dominated the thinking of an entire metropolitan region the way New York was mesmerized by and terrorized by the son of Sam slayings. Looking west across the great South Bay in the general direction of the distant invisible city, George continued, "The sun'll be down in a few hours. Nothing happened last night. Then when they thought it would, maybe tonight. I don't know if I had that answer, I wouldn't be playing Sea Hunt now. Be sure it could be tonight. Maybe the bastard caught the flu yesterday, or maybe he chickened out, or maybe he died, or maybe shit, I don't know. I'll tell you, though, I don't envy those cops. This is one hell of an unbelievable case." Yeah, George nodded. "The big anniversary day is over. Maybe he won't venture out tonight either. But he's over there somewhere on that mainland, just as long as he doesn't take the ferry out to here," he added dryly. On Fire Island, the terror consuming New York seemed far more removed than a ferry ride. It seemed a continent. A lifetime away rather than a 45 or so miles it actually was into the outlying boroughs. For the past 5 months, since early March, the city had been aware that a deranged psychopath was on the loose, shooting down young girls and couples as they embraced in parked cars on Lover's Lane or near discos, stood on porches and walked the night streets. The toll was holding at 11, 5 dead and 6 wounded. Son of Sam, or the 44 caliber killer, had begun his work on July 29, 1976, a year and a day earlier, but the New York City Police Department had taken more than 7 months, separated 5 attacks, to decide it was chasing one gun. That all the shootings were related. As public recognition of the menace grew, so did the fear. The newspapers, particularly the tabloid News and Post, fanned the flames and outdid themselves on the anniversary date of the first shooting. That was yesterday, and the killer hadn't struck, although he'd hinted at an anniversary attack in a macabre letter sent in June to Daily News columnist Jimmy Breslin. "What will you have for July 29th?" he teased. New York's Mayor Abraham Beame, up for re-election, knew that he'd have the biggest dragnet in the city's history, blanketing the boroughs of Queens and the Bronx. Son of Sam's exclusive hunting grounds, this was well and good, but Beame chose to make the announcement in full view of the ever-watchful eye of the cameras, resulting, some thought, in a direct dare to the killer to strike on that night. If that was so, Son of Sam decided to pass, and the 29th of July oozed without incident. However, the sounds of silence on the 29th didn't abate the death watch over the city, which had been operating on the fringes of mass hysteria for months. Thousands of girls with long hair were still cutting it short because all the victims happened to have long hair, and since the hair happened to have been brown in color, blonde wigs were still selling out in stores from Floral Parks in Queens to Van Cortlandt Park in the Bronx. And television crews were stocking beauty parlors across the city to record the shearing and bleaching for showcasing on the nightly news broadcasts. The tastelessness spread to the citizenry, too, because of the extensive publicity surrounding the case. The NYPD's suspect file was bulging with an inconceivable 7,000 names. Some were young men who jilted girlfriends, were determined to even a score, or loan sharks whose clients were hopeful of short-lived reprieves while the police investigated the tipster's allegations. Other suspects were sons believed by their elderly widowed mothers to the exhibiting abnormal behavior, and some were genuine loonies whose names were forwarded to other police jurisdictions for future reference. If and when the detectives who checked the original information remembered to do so, often they didn't. In one case, a woman from Westchester contacted authorities to advise she was certain her ex-husband was the killer, to quote from the official report. She said that just before her divorce, he told her that one of the things he will miss is her long brown hair. She also stated that he loved Italian girls. Most of the victims to that point were Italian American. He has sexual hang-ups and wanted her to get into the sadomasochistic scene with ropes. In addition, this suspect, for whom police did obtain a handwriting sample to compare with the blocked letter Son of Sam notes, also went to discos and topless bars, wore a wig, was brought up in the neighborhood of two of the shootings, owned guns, shot at the TV when he thought no one was around, thought his sexual equipment was under par, and besides all that, looked like police artists' sketches of the Son of Sam, or so the wife said. In yet another incident, two Westchester residents believed they knew the gunman's identity, so they took it upon themselves to drag him to his father's grave to coax a dramatic confession from him. He refused to admit his guilt, however, so they decided to beat him with a baseball bat to get it out of him. Still no go. The killer was seriously injured, and the two vigilantes were promptly arrested. In other graveyard occurrences, police were sent to investigate reports that men were seen dancing on the graves of two 44 victims, one at a Queens cemetery, the other in Bronx. A Bronx cemetery worked was questioned and released. No one was identified in the Queens incident. Each of these leads, no matter how outlandish or unlikely, had to be investigated to some degree at least by the police department's task force, whose burgeoning ranks included many of the elites of the city's detective corps. The problem was, they weren't doing much detecting. They were pushing paper and chasing wild geese all over the metropolitan area. It was demoralizing, as those on the inside knew well there was little guidance and barely any communication between teams and shifts. Detectives would find themselves tuning in the TV news to learn what had happened that day in their own investigation, for eager to see their faces on camera and their names in print. Some task force supervisors were perfectly willing to discuss the case at length with the media. On most days, the task force headquarters at the 109th Precinct in Queens resembled a Hollywood set with camera and sound equipment scattered about. Internally, the special command was known as Omega, as in Watch. Watch TV to find out what's going on was the derisive dismal of the group's effectiveness by some who were there. Nonetheless, by late July, about 300 police, a force larger than most departments in the United States, would be punching their clocks at Omega. And all the while the panic was spreading, covies and psychics visited crime scenes and issued mystically inspired descriptions of the killer and his getaway cars. Numerologists, soothsayers, magicians, and housewives from Queens were tying up police phones for hours, pushing their own theories on the killer's identity and motivation. Motivation. That's where the psychiatrist came in. From studying the incidents and the letter to Breslin, every psychiatrist in Manhattan's Yellow Pages, it seemed, had an opinion on the case, and many of those analyses wormed their way into the newspapers. One of the more popular offerings went like this. Son of Sam was a loner. He hated women and was killing young girls with long brown hair because he'd been rejected by such a girl. His 44 was really a surrogate penis, and when he was firing it, he was really copulating. He was a quiet type who blended right into the crowd. He was religious and alternately felt he was doing God's will and possessed by demons. He attended Catholic schools. The name Son of Sam was a play on Samson, whose hair was cut off by a woman. Son of Sam was emasculated by a woman. The press, anxious for stories on the slow days between attacks, dutifully gave gobs of space to these scattergun diagnoses. On one occasion, the Post even carried a story about a misguided but well-meaning priest who offered himself as a hostage to the murder. Also, during that summer, it seemed as if media were running a surrender to me contest. The city's journalists at Breslin and Pete Hamill of the News, the Post, Steve Dunleavy, and a couple of TV reporters all appealed to Son of Sam to turn himself in to them. Even the Times, the aristocratic gray lady of 43rd Street was dipping her crumpet in the killer's cup, devoting extensive space to the investigation that must have flustered its editors, who liked to consider the paper of record above all things as mass murder. But by late June, the Times realized the killer was fit to print in a big way and joined the fray in earnest, along with Newsweek, Time, and other publications from coast to coast in Europe. It was difficult not to become immersed in hysteria, particularly when a number of citizen groups, media outlets, and corporations began offering reward money that totaled $40,000. But much of the panic was overreaction. The odds against a particular person being shot were immense. There were 11 victims as of July 30th, out of how many millions? Still, it was a horrible, grim lottery. Hello from the gutters of NYC, which are filled with dog manure, vomit, stale wine, urine, and blood. Sam had written Breslin in early June. Then, with words that might have flown from the pen of Poe, he reminded the world, I am still here, like a spirit roaming the night, thirsty, hungry, seldom stopping to rest. The letter was fascinating in its flawless horror and vivid imagery. The case itself was hypnotic. It was the greatest manhunt in New York history, a deadly game between the hunted and the hunters. The letter to Breslin topped it off. Usually people don't learn of a crime until after it's committed. But with Son of Sam, it was much different. People were looking over their shoulders knowing he was out there before he struck. He was terror with a name and identity, the equivalent of the dreaded great white shark stalking the ocean shores. People in New York City felt the fear and became personally involved in the case. The victims were young, white, middle class, and Roman Catholic. It, it so happened Sam had invaded the bedrooms and watering holes in working class New York. The discos in his two targeted boroughs thus far, Queens and the Bronx, were empty because were suffering. The streets were deserted by midnight. New York on July 30th, 1977 was a city under siege, but how did it get that way? According to what the public knew at the time, it had begun quietly on Thursday morning, July 29, 1976, in the Northeast Bronx as Michael and Rose Loria were returning to their roomy, fourth floor apartment at 2860 Borough Avenue in the predominantly Italian-American Pelham Bay section. It was 1 a.m. Loria, a bus company employee in Manhattan, and Rose, an administrative worker at New York Hospital, also in Manhattan, were coming home after attending a wake and stopping briefly at a local restaurant, the Chateau Pelham. As they neared the building, they recognized the 1975 blue-white Oldsmobile double parked in front. It belonged to Jody Valentine, 19, a student nurse and close friend of Loria's daughter Donna, 18. Jody was behind the wheel when talking with Donna, who sat beside her in the passenger seat. Donna had medium-length hair and light brown eyes. She was a pretty young woman and dated often. She was currently on the outs with a boyfriend. Two girls were back from an evening at a discotheque in nearby New Rothschild, located on Long Island Sound in southeastern Westchester County. The disco's name was Peachtree, and in time, a New Rothschild would figure prominently in the Son of Sam story. Donna and Judy, who herself was a pretty girl with shoulder-length flowing brown hair, with regulars at Peachtree's Wednesday night backgammon tournaments. The L'Oreals paused to speak with the girls, and Mike reminded Donna to come upstairs soon because she was due at work in the morning. As he looked up from his conversation with his daughter, Mike Loria noticed a yellow compact-sized auto double parked the street and above 20 yards behind Jody's car. It was occupied by a lone male driver. Unknown to Mike, neighbors had spotted a similar unfamiliar vehicle cruising the area several hours before, at about the time Donna went out. Make sure you don't stay down here too long, Mike advised. He was understanding of the comings and goings of his sons Luis and Michael, but was more protective of Donna, his only girl. Donna offered a compromise, saying she'd wait with Jody while her father went upstairs and brought down her poodle, Bo. Then they'd walk the dog together, Mike L'Oreal agreed, and he and Rose entered the tan brick apartment and rode the elevator to the fourth floor. On the street, Donna and Jody continued their conversation. Donna, who'd been sickly as a child, had blossomed into a healthy young woman, perhaps remembering her past, and she chose a career in the medical field and was now employed by a technician by the Empire State Ambulance Service in Manhattan. Jody Valentine, the student nurse, was a neighbor as well as a friend to Donna and her family. She lived with her parents just 3 blocks away, at 1918 Hutchinson River Parkway. At 1:10 a.m., Donna bid goodnight to Jody and turned to open the door of the double-parked Olds, and her hand pulled the latch open and saw a young man standing on the curb about 8 feet away toward the rear of the car. Donna was startled. Now what was this? She startled to say they were her last words. The man on the curb pulled a gun from a brown paper bag he was carrying, put both hands on the weapon, crouched slightly, and fired 3 shots into the car. Donna raised her right arm as the bullet shattered the closed passenger window. One of the slugs entered above her right elbow, traveled downward through her forearm, exited beneath her wrist, entered her back, and killed her instantly. Donna tumbled from the car and hit the pavement with a sickening thud. Another bullet, apparently aimed at Donna as well, tore into Jody Valentine's left thigh. The third missed. His work done, the killer turned and walked around the corner of Bury and Mayflower Avenues and into infamy. Rose L'Oreal looked directly down from her kitchen window on the 4th floor in response to the noise below. She heard Jody Valentine's horn blaring as she watched curiously as Jody crawled from the car and hobbled back and forth in the middle of the street, shouting at the top of her voice. Then it dawned on Rose, Jody was crying for help. Mike L'Oreal in the stairwell was in the stairwell with the poodle when he heard the series of explosions. He raced outside to Jody's car and he screamed to him, "Donna, Donna." Mike L'Oreal looked down to the pavement and saw his stricken daughter. He rode with her in an ambulance, holding her hand and pleading with her not to die, but it was too late. As for the wounded Jody, her mental anguish was more severe than her thigh injury, which was promptly treated. When police visited the hospital, she was nearly hysterical. But after a time, she provided a detailed description of the gunman. Male, white, 30s, 5'9", 160 pounds, curly, dark hair, mod style, clean-shaven, light complexion, wearing a blue polo shirt with white stripes, dark pants. Although no one knew it, the Son of Sam case had begun. There are typically more than 1,500 murders in New York City annually, and many of them, because of their routine nature or because the victim was a drifter or a bum or even a minority, gets short shrift in the newspapers. But a young white girl from a middle-class family who was slain in a car for no apparent reason was unique enough to be reported in some detail by the city press corps. Still, within days, the story of Donna's death faded from the public consciousness. The name Donna L'Oreal wouldn't surface again until February 1st, 1977, 6 months later. For the police responsible for bringing her killer to ground, Donna's name remained an important one. The investigation of her murder was handled by the 8th Homicide Zone, which covered the Pelham Bay area. At that time, homicide detectives were a breed apart, the elite of the NYPD. The city was divided into districts or zones of homicide, with the detectives assigned to each responsible for the slayings that occurred within those boundary lines. The homicide cops worked only murder cases. Other officers handled robbery, burglars, vice, organized crime, etc. It was an efficient system, allowing for much needed specialization in homicide investigation. It has since been discarded. But at the outset of the Loria probe, the police knew two things. One, Jody Valentine said she didn't recognize the killer, and two, the ballistics examination indicated the weapon used was a large 44 caliber handgun, a 44 caliber Bulldog revolver, not a common firearm in New York. A powerful weapon that fires 5 rounds. The Bulldog is designed for only one purpose, to kill people, and at close range it is effective. Its drawbacks are that it is difficult to control of a strong recoil, yeah, if you're a bitch, or kick, and it isn't very accurate beyond a distance of some 20 feet. If you suck, yeah. After which the velocity of the bullet also decreases markedly. For what any other apparent mo- For want of any other apparent motive, the detectives believed that one of Donna's former or current boyfriends was somehow involved in the killing, or that the attack was a result of an organized crime mistake, a hit on the wrong person. There had been some mob-related activity in the general vicinity in the preceding few months, including a couple of shootings. The police speculated that some contract killer might have shot Donna in a case of mistaken identity. Such things have happened before. Much to his chagrin, some detectives began to insinuate that bus company employees Mike Loria was himself connected to organized crime. Mike, to understate the issue, was livid. These stories never reached the public, however. The existence of the double-parked compact yellow car and the sighting of a similar autos several hours before the shooting were also withheld. The investigation, after some promising early leads, evaporated went nowhere. And as of October 23rd, there was no progress to report in the Loria case, and barring new developments, the folder would find its way to an open but inactive file. At 1:15 a.m. on Saturday, October 23rd, Rosemary Keenan, 18, and daughter of an NYPD detective, Carl DeNaro, 20, and former department store record salesman and security guard at Citibank in Manhattan, left a Flushing, Queens bar called Peck's and rode a half a dozen blocks in her navy blue Volkswagen to a darkened spot in a residential area near the corner of 159th Street and 33rd Avenue. With brown shoulder-length hair, DeNaro had tried to picture himself as he'd looked in a week's time after the Air Force, which he'd just joined, trimmed his tonsorial splendor to meet military regulations. Keenan, a student at Queens College, knew DeNaro casually before their late-night encounter at Peck's, where DeNaro was toasting his final days as a civilian. Invited to join the party she had, and now the two were escaping the madding crowd for a few moments alone before Rosemary's curfew time. DeNaro was in the passenger seat as the bug slowed to a halt on the quiet tree-lined block after turning off the engine. Rosemary glanced in her rearview mirror and noticed the passing of a solitary jogger as he crossed her line of vision. Then for a short 5 minutes their world was still until 1:30 a.m., when it exploded around them in a shower of glass. As the couple reflexively ducked in shock and surprise, both the driver's and the passenger's window blew out with a deafening roar, and the speedometer suddenly shattered. its needle jolting forward and jammed stuck at 30. Large caliber bullets whining through the front passenger's window were causing the eruption. Other slugs slammed into the right side of the roof, causing the eruption. Slammed into the right side of the roof of the VW as the gunman apparently struggled to adjust the weapon's recoil. In contrast with Loria's shooting, the assailant was having some trouble, but neither Rosemary or Denaro knew they were being fired on, not even when Denario felt the force of something slicing through the back of his head. On the right side, instinctively he reached behind and put his hand into his own warm, seeping blood. "Get out of here! Get out of here!" he screamed. Rosemary lunged for the ignition switch, clicked it on, ground the Beetle into first gear, and the car lurched forward as she struggled to regain her composure and cope with a reluctant clutch. Shaking, crying, she stared at Carl and was horrified to see he was covered with blood, disorientated, not thinking clearly enough to drive it to the hospital. She sped the 6 blocks back to Peck's, where they both staggered inside. Denaro, still not knowing he'd been shot, collapsed. He would spend the next 3 weeks in Flushing Hospital and return there for an additional 10 days on January 20th. As Jimmy Carter was taking the oath of the office of President of the United States, doctors were implanting a steel plate into Denaro's head. Rosemary Keenan escaped unhurt, the attacker perhaps mistaken Denaro for a woman because of his long hair, had vented his fury at the young man instead of the short-haired college student. If Carl Denaro had been less of a hippie, Rosemary Keenan might not be alive today. The Queens detective from the 109th Precinct assigned to the case learned from NYPD's ballistic laboratory that a .44 caliber handgun was used to shoot Denaro. Beyond that, the ballistic technicians were stymied due to the deformed condition of the slugs. They couldn't determine any particular make or model of .44. And all of the NYPD's ballistics work was performed in the same lab in Manhattan, whether a shooting occurred there or in Queens, Brooklyn, Staten Island, or the Bronx. So into a file went the slides and bullets recovered from the Denaro assault. The evidence obtained from Laria's scene in the Bronx already lay in another folder in the lab. With no answers forthcoming from the ballistics examination, the detectives pursued other avenues. Rosemary Keenan's father, Redmond, a second-grade detective with more than 20 years' experience, participated in the probe, but there were no witnesses to the attack and nothing in Demaro's background or Rosemary's surfaced as a possible motive. So, as with the Loria case 3 months earlier, the inquiry went nowhere. Lack of apparent motive aside, no one noted the similarities between the shootings. Young people, late at night, shot in cars for no discernible reason. No one pointed out that some type of .44 revolver was used in both incidents. The attack, when occurred in boroughs separated by the short spans of the Throgs Neck and Whitestone bridges, might as well have happened 6,000 miles apart. Carl Denaro's wounding was in and out of the newspapers in the course of one day. The next assault in the lengthening string would in time develop into one of the most critical and telling episodes of the saga of Sam. This was so because, in contrast to the Denaro case, there were witnesses, 3 of them. 2 would look straight into the shooter's face from less than 10 feet away. He would even speak to them. These were the 2 young victims who would survive to describe the event in detail and provide descriptions of the gunman, which would differ markedly from Jody Valentine's eyewitness portrayal of the man who murdered Donna Loria. Saturday, November 27, 1976, began with a blustery binge of a chilling wind whipped through the canyons of Midtown Manhattan, carrying scraps of paper, debris, and yesterday's headlines through the midnight air. On various street corners in the Broadway area, the hardiest of vendors, wearing ancient woolen caps and ear flaps lowered, huddled near their carts of roasting chestnuts, the smoldering aromas tipped skyward by the wind, blended with the assorted litter gusting its way from the gutter to sidewalk to doorway. Leaving the movie theater, the two young friends bundled themselves against the sudden cold and hastened for the warmth of the underground station. Soon a graffiti-splashed subway train, clattering and swaying on its path beneath the East River, took them home to Queens. In their burrow again, they left the train at 179th Street and Hillsdale Avenue and boarded the bus and brought them to the corner of Hillside and 262nd Street, less than a block from Joanne's Lamino's house. Joanne, 18, graduated from Miami Van Buren High School the preceding summer and was seeking a job as a secretary. So far, she hadn't found anything to her liking. But since she lived at home with her parents, the pressure to find regular employment wasn't excessive. Although her family was hopeful she'd find full-time work before the new year began, he complained Donna DeMasi was 16 and still enrolled at Van Buren. She was tall, slender, and attractive, and her long dark hair contrasted with Joanne's, whose blonde tresses were shorter. After stepping from the bus, the girls walked leisurely down 262nd Street, talking animatedly as they went. It was a good time of the year. The family get-togethers of Thanksgiving were just 2 days previous, and the girls were now anticipating the Christian season. When they reached the front of the Lomino home, a small two-story dwelling with a modest front yard cut by a walk which led to a tiny cement porch, Joanne and Donna continued their conversation on the steps. Across from the house, with a powerful street lamp, cast a reassuring halo of light onto the immediate area. Now mindless in the cold, the two teenagers chatted on for several more minutes, and then they saw him. Actually, Donna spotted him first, but as he strode onto the grass and halted just 8 feet from the girls, Joanne, who'd been facing sideways with her back to the man, looked over her shoulder to study him also. He was dressed in what appeared to be a green form-fitting 3/4-length coat, perhaps an army fatigue jacket. He was slim and about 150 to 160 pounds, and stood about 5 feet 8. His hair was longish, straight, parted and dirty blonde in color. His eyes were a piercing dark brown. The girls were somewhat nervous and not frightened by the man, who seemed to be lost. As if to confirm their speculation, he began speaking in the high-pitched voice. "Can you tell me how to get—" He never finished the question. Instead, he yanked a revolver from his coat and began firing. Joanne, still with her back to the gunman, although her face was looking into his, was jarred sideways, and his first slug tore into her spinal cord and continued on, puncturing a lung. Donna on a lower step, was struck next as she lunged away from the spitting gun. A large caliber bullet entered the base of her neck and barely missed her spine. Like fragile, broken mannequins, the two girls tumbled from opposite sides of the porch and onto the surrounding bushes. The attacker kept firing, the remaining bullets splattering the front of the house and smashing the living room window. His weapon finally empty, the gunman fled down to the 262nd Street toward 81st Avenue as a witness who heard the shots ran outside and watched closely as he hurried by carrying the gun in his left hand. Donna DeMasi lay in Long Island Jewish Hospital for nearly 3 weeks, recovering from her wound, and wore a neck brace for months afterwards. Joanne Lomino wasn't as fortunate. Her stay at the Long Island Jewish lasted 3 months and was followed by another 120 days at a Rusk Institute in Manhattan, where she underwent habitation therapy. She was now a paraplegic and would live the rest of her life in a wheelchair. The investigation of the assault fell to the detectives at Queens 105th Precinct. Once again, the ballistics of the people were so unreliable. Once again, the ballistics people were unable to be much help, since the recovered bullets were too deformed for any precise comparisons to be made, beyond the conclusion that the slugs came from the same model of .44 revolver. The laboratory analysis was fruitless. And as in the case of Donna Lauria and Carl Denaro, background checks on the victims covered no apparent motive for the attack. Still, no one connected the 3 incidents. As the Christmas season came and went, there were no further developments in any of the cases. 3 composite sketches had been prepared, one of Jody's Valentine's descriptions and of the Laurel killer, another from a combined effort by Joanne Lomino and Donna DeMasi, a third from the witness who saw the assistant flee the scene. The 2 Queens sketches were very familiar, bearing primarily on the location of the parts attackers' long, straight, and blondish hair. The girls remembered the part was on the left side. The witness recalled it was on the right, but that a part did exist was not the question. In any event, the drawings looked nothing like that of the man who murdered Donna Lauria, whose hair was dark and curled into a bushy perm. That man was also a younger and heavier than Lomino DeMasi shooter, and his nose, eyes, and mouth were shaped differently from those of the Queen's assailant. And still another Queen's resident would be the next to fall to the nameless force behind the .44 caliber shooter, and she would die. The new year, 1977, was the year of the cat, and Al Stewart's haunting hit of that title climbed the charts in the early months. It was midwinter, and it was freezing bitter cold. On January 29th, the mercury in New York registered a scant 14 degrees above zero. At midnight, neared 3,000 miles to the west of this Saturday, comedian Freddie Prinze had just died from a bullet wound to the head, self-inflicted in a trip accident. In Forest Hills, Queens, in the shadow of the West Side Tennis Club, then the site of the U.S. Open, Christine Freund, a 26-year-old secretary who would become victim number 6. Several years later, the events surrounding Christine's murder would provide pivotal clues in the search for the conspirators who aided David Berkowitz in the shootings. But for the present, the following highlights will outline the story. Australian-born Christine Freund, a diminutive 5'2", was a beautiful young woman with long, dark brown hair that cascaded over her shoulders to a point midway down her back. Her parents, Nano and Olga, emigrated to the United States when Chris was 5 and found a new home in the bustling Ridgewood section of Queens. Soon after their arrival, Olga gave birth to another daughter, Eva. Together, the sisters were the spark of the middle-class Freud household, and both were now employed in secretarial positions in Manhattan. In 1972, Chris was hired by the Wall Street firm of Reynolds Securities and currently worked out of its office at 2 Broadway in the heart of the financial district. For a short time, she'd taken courses at Lehman College in the Bronx. But as her relationship grew with her boyfriend, John Deal, her interests changed. Deal, 30, was a soccer aficionado who earned his money as a bartender at the Ridgewood 3, a neighborhood watering hole. He and Chris had survived an up-and-down relationship and were planning to announce their engagement in 2 weeks on Valentine's Day. On that frigid Saturday evening of July 29th, Deal called for Christine at her Linden Street home in his blue Pontiac Firebird, and they drove to the Forest Hill Theater to watch Sylvester Stallone conquer the world in the original Rocky. It was Chris's second consecutive evening in a theater. The night before, she remained in Manhattan with 2 girlfriends and attended the Broadway production of Godspell. 24 hours before meeting the devil, Christine had joyously sung Day by Day with Jesus. Following Rocky, Chris and Deal trekked the snowy streets of the Wine Gallery restaurant on nearby Austin Street. After a light meal and some Irish coffee, the bundled couple began to walk to Deal's car, which was parked several blocks away in Station Plaza near the Long Island Railroad tracks. Their next stop was to be a Masonic dance at the hall where they first met 7 years before. At the corner of Austin, a Continental Avenue, they passed a lone hitchhiker with an orange knapsack, and neighbors saw a man in a small green foreign car drop off a passenger with a suitcase at the train station at about this time. Back in the car, Deal revved the engine and let it warm up for about 2 minutes in the cold night air. He inserted the latest ABBA tape in the stereo, and the sound of the newly released Dancing Queen filled the auto. Chris nestled close to John, and they hugged briefly. "God, it's cold," she remarked. The couple then sat back and prepared to leave. At that moment, the first of 3 .44 caliber slugs crashed through the passenger side window. "Chris, Chris," Deal hollered, pulling her down as 2 more shots roared into the car. One passed through Christine's shoulder and entered her back. The other missed and blew out a hole in the windshield of the driver's side. On the driver's side, and then it was over. Deal, quaking in fear and anguish, kept his head down until he was sure the onslaught had ended. Reaching for Chris, he pulled her to him. When he took his hands away, he saw they were covered with blood. "Chris, Chris," he shouted again, but Chris didn't answer. Frantic, Deal propped his fiancée up in the seat and fled the car, running madly to Continental Avenue for help. Waving his arms wildly, he rushed to a couple stopped at a red light. "My girl's been hurt. Please help me," he blurted. The couple took him back to his car, and as Deal leaned in to check on Chris, they left. Deal then glanced across Station Plaza, saw a man entering the Forest Hills Inn, and let out a rather interesting cry. Mister, they shot her. They shot my girl." The man stared at Deal and kept going. "They shot my girl," Deal yelled again, as the 2 neighbors heard him and phoned the police. But on the street, Deal alone again, and with no help in sight, jumped into his car. Seeing that Chris hadn't moved, he floored the Firebird and squealed to a halt in the center of the Continental and Burns Avenue's intersection, blocking traffic. Finally, he had help. But it was too late for Christine Freund. She died shortly afterwards at 4:10 a.m. in St. John's Hospital. The shooting had occurred at 12:40 a.m. January 30th, 1977. The cause of Christine's death was a bullet wound in the head. Deal had dragged his girlfriend down one shot too late. Finally, the police began to rumble. The ballistics test failed to link the bullets fired at Christine to any other shooting, but once again it was noted that a .44 caliber weapon, identified as a Charters Arms Bulldog model, had been used. Not one particular .44 Bulldog to the exclusion of all the others, but a .44 caliber Bulldog. On February 1st, Pete Bernstein of the Daily News wrote, "More than 50 detectives are investigating possible links between the murder of Christine Freund in Forest Hills, Queens, early Sunday, and 3 episodes late last year, 2 in Queens and 1 in the Bronx. The 2 young women have been killed and 3 were wounded, one of them seriously, in the 4 incidents. We are leaning toward a connection in all these cases," said Sergeant Richard Conlon of the Queens 15th Homicide Zone. "In each of the cases, a single gunman, acting without apparent motive, emerged in the early morning darkness to shoot down his unsuspecting victims." Accompanying the article, which erroneously stated that Carl Denaro hadn't been injured, were a photo of Chris and Deal, a map of the 3 Queens shooting sites, and police composite sketches from Loria and Lomino de Masi shootings. The drawings differed so widely, the caption referred to more than one suspect. Police sketches of suspects in Lomino de Masi shootings in Queens and slaying in the Bronx last July. The most crucial words in the article were Sergeant Conlon's leaning toward a connection. Simply, the police weren't sure. The circumstances of the attacks led them to suspect a single gun was behind all of them, a relatively uncommon .44 Bulldog. But they had no evidence, and more importantly, they certainly had no proof that one particular man was responsible. Their own composites clearly indicated otherwise. In addition, there were other possible motives for Christine Freund's slaying, motives which would remain hidden within the police department. But despite the cautious approach chosen by the police in February, March would whirl with a pungent wind that would blow all that rightful reticence into the gutter. From that point, when the bosses and politicians bowled into the case, there would be one man and one gun, regardless of what the facts were. But New York's press and citizenry wouldn't know that. The media and the public wouldn't believe that a single crazed psychopath was prowling the nighttime streets. It was nearly time for the birth of the .44 caliber killer. Whew. These are long chapters, aren't they? That's it for chapter 2.